The letter from the HOA arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew immediately it was going to ruin my entire week. I'm Owen Caldwell, and I've lived in my house in Prescott, Arizona, for 15 years, long before the Copper Ridge Homeowners Association even existed. My property has a well that's been operating since 1978, perfectly legal and grandfathered in under every zoning law imaginable. Dear Mr. Caldwell, the letter began in that condescending tone these things always have. It has come to our attention that your residential well is not in compliance with current community standards. You are hereby required to cap the well and connect to municipal water services within 60 days or face fines of $500 per day. I read it 3 times, each time getting angrier. The signature at the bottom belonged to Patricia Henderson, the HOA president who'd made it her personal mission to bring everyone in the neighborhood under her thumb. She was exactly what you'd picture. Blonde bob, oversized sunglasses permanently perched on her head, and a voice that could shatter glass when she wasn't getting her way. I picked up my phone and called my neighbor, Frank Martinez. He'd dealt with Patricia before when she tried to fine him for painting his mailbox the wrong shade of beige. Frank, you're not going to believe this. Let me guess. Patricia, she wants me to cap my well and connect to city water. Frank let out a low whistle. Can she do that? That well was there before any of this HOA nonsense. That's what I thought. I'm calling my lawyer. My attorney, Richard Kovacs, had handled my property purchase years ago. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment before responding. Owen, they don't have a leg to stand on. Your well is grandfathered in. The property deed explicitly mentions the well, and Arizona law protects existing water rights. This is harassment. So what do I do? Respond in writing, cite the relevant statutes, and tell them to back off. I'll draft something for you. I felt better after hanging up, but something nagged at me. Why would Patricia suddenly care about my well? I'd had it for 15 years without issue. The HOA had only formed 7 years ago when the new subdivision went up next to my property. My house sat on 3 acres, while the new development had packed 40 homes into a 50-acre plot. That evening, I walked my property line, something I did occasionally to check the fencing. The sun was setting, painting the Arizona sky in brilliant oranges and purples. That's when I noticed something odd near the eastern fence line. There was a section where the ground looked disturbed, and when I got closer, I saw what appeared to be a relatively new pipe coming up from the ground before disappearing back into the earth. I knelt down, brushing away some of the dirt. The pipe was maybe 2 inches in diameter, made of PVC. I followed its path with my eyes and realized it was heading directly toward the new subdivision. My subdivision. Patricia's subdivision. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. The next morning, I called a well inspector named Tom Berkshire who'd serviced my well for years. He was a weathered man in his 60s who knew water systems like most people knew their own names. Tom, I need you to come out and check something. And bring whatever equipment you need to trace pipes. He arrived within 2 hours, his white truck loaded with diagnostic equipment. I showed him the pipe I'd found, and his expression darkened immediately. Owen, that's a tap line. Someone's pulling water from somewhere, and given where we are, I'd bet money they're tapping your well. We spent the next 3 hours tracing lines and checking my well system. Tom used ground-penetrating radar and pressure sensors. What he found made my blood boil. You've got 3 unauthorized connections to your well system. 3. They're sophisticated too, with pressure regulators so you wouldn't notice the draw under normal circumstances. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. How much water are we talking about? Tom pulled out his tablet and showed me the numbers. Based on these readings and the pipe diameters, I'd estimate they've been pulling approximately 2,000 gallons a day from your well, maybe more during summer. I did the quick math in my head. 2,000 gallons a day for 7 years. That was over 5 million gallons of my water. My electricity had been running the pump. My equipment had been under the strain. Can you document everything? I mean everything. Photos, measurements, flow rates, all of it. Already on it. Owen, this is theft. This is also illegal as hell. You need to call the county water authority and probably the police. I thanked Tom and paid him for his time, making sure I had copies of everything he documented. Then I sat on my back porch and thought about my next move. Patricia Henderson wanted me to cap my well. Patricia Henderson, whose subdivision had been built right when these tap lines would have been installed. Patricia Henderson, who was probably paying a fortune in water bills for 40 homes, unless she'd found a way to steal it from someone with an existing well. My phone rang. It was Richard, my lawyer. Owen, I've drafted that response to the HOA, but I want to run something by you first. I did some digging into the Copper Ridge HOA finances. They're public record and something's off. What do you mean? The water bills for the common areas and the community center are surprisingly low, suspiciously low. The subdivision has extensive landscaping, a pool, and that community center with showers and bathrooms. Their water bills should be astronomical, especially in Arizona. But they're not. I told Richard what Tom had found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Owen, don't send the response letter yet. We're going to the sheriff's office. This is criminal theft and we need to get ahead of it. If they're trying to force you to cap the well, it's probably because they know you're going to discover their theft eventually. They're trying to destroy the evidence. Exactly. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Office in Prescott was busy when Richard and I arrived the next morning. We asked to speak to someone about water theft and property crime, and after a 20-minute wait, we were shown into an office belonging to Detective Sarah Reeves. Detective Reeves was in her 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. I laid out everything. The HOA letter, the tap lines, Tom's report, and Richard's findings about the suspicious water bills. She listened without interrupting, taking notes. When I finished, she sat back in her chair. Mr. Caldwell, if what you're saying is accurate, this is significant theft. We're talking about thousands of dollars in water and electricity costs over 7 years. I'll need to get a warrant to inspect the HOA's water infrastructure and examine their records. How long will that take? I asked. A few days, maybe a week, but I need you to do something for me. Don't confront anyone from the HOA. Don't tip them off that you know about the theft. Can you do that? I nodded, though every fiber of my being wanted to march over to Patricia's house and demand answers. One more thing, Richard said. They've given him 60 days to cap the well or face daily fines. We need to stop that clock. Detective Reeves made a note. I'll contact the HOA and inform them that the property is part of an ongoing investigation. That should freeze any enforcement action. Walking out of the sheriff's office, I felt a mix of vindication and anger. Someone had been stealing from me for years, running up my electric bill, wearing down my equipment, and using my water rights without permission. And now they had the audacity to try to force me to cap the well to cover their tracks. Richard put a hand on my shoulder. Owen, this is going to get messy. HOAs have insurance and legal funds. They'll fight this. Let them fight. I've got the truth on my side. The next day, I got a call from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Mr. Caldwell, this is Patricia Henderson. I understand there's been some misunderstanding about the well situation. Her voice was saccharine sweet, nothing like the imperious tone I'd heard at HOA meetings. I don't think there's any misunderstanding, Patricia. Your letter was pretty clear. Well, perhaps we were a bit hasty. I'd like to invite you to an emergency HOA board meeting this Saturday to discuss the matter. I'm sure we can reach a reasonable accommodation. I remembered Detective Reeves' warning about not tipping them off, so I kept my voice neutral. I'll think about it. Please do. We're all neighbors here, Owen. We should be working together, not against each other. After she hung up, I immediately called Detective Reeves and relayed the conversation. They're spooked, she said. Someone probably told them we contacted the water authority. Don't go to that meeting. Let me get that warrant first. Saturday came and went. I didn't attend the HOA meeting. Instead, I stayed home and watched as Tom Berkshire came back to install flow meters on the tap lines. These would give us real-time data on exactly how much water was being stolen. Owen, you're not going to believe this, Tom said as he finished the installation. These taps are pulling even more water than I initially estimated. Look at this. The digital readout on his equipment showed water flowing through the pipes at a steady rate. That's the community center, he said, pointing to one line. And that one's feeding the main irrigation system for the common areas. The third one, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it might be feeding into their main water distribution somehow. Can they even do that? Connect stolen water to a municipal system? Not legally, no. But if someone knew what they were doing and didn't care about laws, they could set up a system where your well supplements their municipal water. During high-demand times, your water fills the gap, and the city meters don't show the full usage. It was more sophisticated than I'd imagined. This wasn't some neighbors sneaking a hose over the fence. This was planned, engineered infrastructure theft. The following Tuesday, Detective Reeves called. We have the warrant. We're executing it tomorrow morning at 6. I wanted to give you a heads up. It's going to be visible and the neighborhood's going to know something's happening. I understand, Mr. Caldwell. One more thing. We pulled the construction permits for the Copper Ridge subdivision. The engineering plans don't show any connections to private wells, but we found something interesting. The contractor who did the underground utilities. His wife is on the HOA board. Linda Patterson. Know her? I did. Linda was Patricia's right-hand woman, always sitting next to her at meetings, nodding along to every decision. This gets deeper, Detective Reeves continued. We're bringing in the county attorney's office. This might be bigger than simple theft. I barely slept that night. By 5:30 the next morning, I was dressed and drinking coffee, watching the street from my front window. Right at 6, 3 sheriff's vehicles pulled into the Copper Ridge subdivision, followed by trucks from the county water authority. My phone started ringing almost immediately. First Frank, then other neighbors I knew. I let it go to voicemail. By 7, 2 news vans had arrived. By 8, there were 4. Richard called at 8:30. Owen, I'm getting calls from reporters. The HOA's lawyer also contacted me. They want to meet. What did you tell them? That any meeting would need to include the sheriff's office and the county attorney. He hung up pretty quickly after that. I spent the morning watching the activity. Sheriff's deputies were photographing everything, following pipes, taking measurements. The county water inspector was there with his own team, checking meters and connections. Around 11, I saw them enter the community center with what looked like document boxes. At noon, I noticed Patricia Henderson standing on her front lawn, talking animatedly with 2 other women from the HOA board. One of them was Linda Patterson. Even from a distance, I could see the panic on their faces. My doorbell rang around 1. It was a reporter from the local news station, KTVK out of Phoenix. Mr. Caldwell, I'm Jessica Torres from Channel 3. We're covering the investigation at the Copper Ridge HOA. Can you comment on what's happening? I'd been expecting this. Richard and I had discussed how to handle media inquiries. I can tell you that I've lived on this property for 15 years. My well has been here since 1978, long before any HOA existed. Recently, I discovered unauthorized connections to my well system. The sheriff's office is investigating. That's all I can say right now. Is it true that the HOA has been stealing your water for years? That's part of the investigation. There are reports that you've been asked to cap your well. Is that true? I pulled out the HOA letter and showed it to her. She took photos and asked if she could film me on my property. I agreed, figuring public pressure wouldn't hurt my case. The story aired that evening. I watched it with a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. Jessica Torres had done her homework, showing the HOA letter, interviewing water rights attorneys about grandfathered wells, and getting a statement from the sheriff's office confirming an ongoing investigation into water theft. The HOA declined to comment, but the camera had caught Patricia Henderson pulling into her garage, refusing to roll down her window when Jessica approached. My phone exploded. Friends I hadn't heard from in years called to offer support. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and angry stories about their own experiences with the HOA. Frank brought over beer and stayed until midnight, sharing every grievance he'd stored up against Patricia and her board. "You know what burns me up?" Frank said, opening his third beer. "We pay HOA dues, $600 a year. Where's that money going if they're stealing water? They should have plenty to pay their bills." It was a good question, and one I made sure to pass along to Detective Reeves when she called the next morning. "Mr. Caldwell, we found significant irregularities in the HOA's financial records. The water bills for the subdivision are roughly 40% of what they should be based on usage models. We also found emails between Patricia Henderson and the contractor's wife, Linda Patterson, discussing the well connections. What did the emails say? Enough to establish knowledge and intent. There's a particularly damning one from 3 years ago where Mrs. Henderson asks Mrs. Patterson if the well owner had noticed anything, and Mrs. Patterson responds that the connections are deep enough and well hidden that it would take a professional inspection to find them. So they knew exactly what they were doing. Absolutely. We're meeting with the county attorney this afternoon. I expect charges will be filed within the week. What kind of charges? That's up to the county attorney, but we're looking at felony theft, conspiracy, possibly fraud. The value of the stolen water and electricity over 7 years exceeds $50,000. In Arizona, that's a Class 2 felony. After hanging up, I sat on my back porch and looked out over my property. $50,000. They'd stolen $50,000 worth of resources from me, while telling me my well wasn't up to their standards. The audacity was breathtaking. That afternoon, I got a certified letter from a law firm in Phoenix. It was from the HOA's attorney, officially withdrawing the demand that I cap my well and apologizing for any inconvenience. The language was careful, admitting nothing about the theft but clearly trying to distance the HOA from the enforcement action. Too little, too late. Richard called after receiving his own copy. They're trying to minimize liability. This letter is carefully worded to make it seem like the well issue was separate from the board's actions. Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything. We're going to file a civil suit once the criminal charges are sorted out. Civil suit? Owen, they stole from you for 7 years. You're entitled to compensation for the water, the electricity, the wear on your equipment, and your attorney's fees. We're also going to argue for punitive damages because this was intentional and malicious. How much are we talking about? Conservatively, $200,000. Maybe more if we can prove the HOA board enriched themselves personally by keeping dues high while stealing water to reduce expenses. The next week crawled by. I avoided the subdivision, tired of the stares and whispers. Some neighbors were supportive, but others seemed to blame me for bringing negative attention to the area. Property values were already dropping as news of the scandal spread. On Friday, Detective Reeves called. "Mr. Caldwell, can you come to the sheriff's office this afternoon? The county attorney wants to meet with you." I arrived at 2, and Richard met me in the parking lot. We were shown into a conference room where Detective Reeves was waiting with a man in his 50s wearing a suit. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm Deputy County Attorney Marcus Webb. Thank you for coming in." We shook hands and sat down. Marcus opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. "Mr. Caldwell, we've completed our investigation, and I want to walk you through what we found and what charges we'll be filing." For the next hour, Marcus laid out a case that was even worse than I'd imagined. The HOA board, led by Patricia Henderson and Linda Patterson, had conspired to tap into my well during the subdivision's construction. Linda's husband, the contractor, had installed the connections using falsified permits that claimed they were installing backup irrigation lines. The HOA had saved an estimated $75,000 in water, costs over 7 years. They'd used some of those savings to pay themselves inflated salaries for board service, something that was against the HOA's own bylaws. Patricia had been paying herself $15,000 a year as president. Linda took $10,000 as treasurer. "We're filing charges against 5 individuals," Marcus said. "Patricia Henderson, Linda Patterson, and 3 other board members who we can prove knew about the arrangement. The charges include conspiracy to commit theft, felony theft, fraud, and embezzlement of HOA funds." "What kind of sentences are we looking at?" Richard asked. "That depends on many factors, including prior records and whether they take a plea deal, but felony theft of this magnitude typically carries 2 to 7 years in prison." I felt a grim satisfaction. These were serious charges with serious consequences. "When will you make the arrests?" I asked. "Monday morning. We wanted to give you advance notice because it's going to be a media circus. I'd recommend staying away from the subdivision if possible." Monday morning, I ignored my own advice and drove past the subdivision entrance around 9. 3 sheriff's vehicles were already there, and I watched as Patricia Henderson was led out of her house in handcuffs. She was wearing a purple tracksuit and crying, a far cry from the imperious HOA president who terrorized the neighborhood. The local news covered the arrests extensively. All 5 board members were taken into custody and booked on multiple felony charges. Their bail hearing was set for Tuesday. I watched the news coverage that evening with Frank and his wife, Maria. The anchor ran through the charges while showing photos of each defendant. The story had gone statewide, picked up by news outlets in Phoenix and Tucson. HOA horror stories always resonated with viewers, and this one had everything: theft, conspiracy, abuse of power, and a David versus Goliath element. "Owen, you're famous," Maria said, refilling my wine glass. "I don't want to be famous. I just want my water back and these people held accountable." "You're going to get that," Frank said. "No way they beat these charges. The evidence is overwhelming." He was right. At the bail hearing on Tuesday, the judge set high bonds for all 5 defendants. Patricia's was set at $100,000, requiring $10,000 in cash to post. She couldn't make it and had to spend another 3 days in jail before her family scrambled together the money. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving both sides time to prepare. In the meantime, Richard filed our civil lawsuit against the HOA and the 5 board members personally. We sued for compensatory damages of $150,000 and punitive damages of $300,000. The lawsuit got almost as much media attention as the criminal charges. Richard gave interviews explaining how HOAs, while intended to maintain property values and community standards, could become vehicles for petty tyranny and, in extreme cases like this one, outright theft. The problem is that HOAs operate with minimal oversight, Richard told one reporter. They have the power to fine homeowners, place liens on properties, and even foreclose on homes. But there's often no mechanism to check whether the HOA board itself is operating legally and ethically. The story resonated. Richard started getting calls from other homeowners around Arizona with their own HOA horror stories. He couldn't take all the cases, but he referred them to other attorneys and started talking about the need for HOA reform legislation. Meanwhile, I dealt with the practical aspects of securing my well. Tom Berkshire came back and helped me install locks and security measures on all the access points. We removed the unauthorized tap lines and repaired the damage to my system. I also installed security cameras covering the well and the property lines. The work cost me $8,000, which I added to the civil lawsuit. 6 weeks later, the preliminary hearing arrived. I sat in the courtroom with Richard, watching as Patricia Henderson and the other defendants were arraigned. They all pled not guilty, though their lawyers looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The judge heard arguments about whether there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. The prosecutor presented a devastating case. Photos of the tap lines, engineering reports proving they were unauthorized, emails showing knowledge and intent, and financial records showing the HOA's suspiciously low water bills and the inflated board salaries. The defense attorneys tried to argue that the tap lines could have been installed by the original contractor without the board's knowledge, but the emails destroyed that theory. There was a particularly damning exchange where Patricia had written to Linda saying, "The well situation is working perfectly. No one suspects anything, and we're saving a fortune. Make sure your husband keeps quiet." The judge found probable cause on all charges and set a trial date for 4 months out. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. Richard gave a brief statement about being pleased with the ruling and looking forward to our civil trial, which was scheduled for 2 months after the criminal trial. Patricia Henderson's lawyer, a slick guy from Phoenix named Gerald Watts, tried to do damage control. My client maintains her innocence and looks forward to proving that in court. This is all a misunderstanding that's been blown out of proportion. Jessica Torres from Channel 3 wasn't having it. "Mr. Watts, how do you explain the emails where your client explicitly discusses the unauthorized well connections? Those emails have been taken out of context. What context makes stealing $50,000 of water acceptable?" Gerald walked away without answering, and the clip went viral on social media. Over the next few months, the story took on a life of its own. National news outlets picked it up as an example of HOA overreach. I was interviewed by CNN, MSNBC, and even the Wall Street Journal. Each time, I tried to emphasize that this wasn't just about me. It was about the need for accountability and oversight of HOAs across the country. The publicity had an unexpected benefit. Arizona state legislators introduced a bill that would require annual financial audits of all HOAs managing more than 20 properties. The bill would also establish a state office to investigate HOA complaints and enforce penalties for boards that violated the law. I was invited to testify before the state legislature, which was surreal. I'd never been particularly political, but standing in front of lawmakers and explaining what had happened to me felt important. If my experience could help prevent this from happening to someone else, the whole nightmare would be worth it. The criminal trial began on a Monday in late September. Prescott was experiencing its usual beautiful fall weather, cool mornings warming to pleasant afternoons. The courthouse was packed with reporters, curious locals, and other homeowners who'd had their own battles with HOAs. The prosecutor, Marcus Webb, delivered a methodical opening statement laying out the evidence. The defense attorneys each took their turn trying to minimize their clients' roles. Patricia's lawyer argued she'd been misled by Linda Patterson and didn't understand the technical aspects of what was happening. Linda's lawyer claimed she'd trusted her husband to do everything legally and had no reason to believe otherwise. The other three defendants' lawyers claimed their clients had minimal involvement and shouldn't be held responsible for Patricia and Linda's actions. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution called Tom Berkshire to explain the well system and how the unauthorized taps worked. They called county water officials to explain the discrepancy between expected and actual water usage for the subdivision. They called an electrician to testify about my increased power bills from running the well pump more frequently. Most devastatingly, they called Linda Patterson's husband, Derek, who'd been given immunity in exchange for his testimony. Derek was a broken man, clearly regretting his choices. He testified that Patricia had approached him during the subdivision's planning phase with the idea of tapping my well. She said it would save the HOA money and keep dues lower for homeowners, Derek testified. She said the well owner was rich and wouldn't miss the water. She promised me that Linda could protect me because she'd be on the HOA board. Did you have any concerns about the legality of this plan? Marcus asked. Of course I did, but Patricia was very persuasive. She said it happened all the time, that HOAs had special rights to resources within their boundaries. I knew that wasn't true, but I convinced myself it was a gray area. What convinced you to participate? Derek looked down. Patricia offered me an extra $50,000 in cash off the books to install the taps and keep quiet about them. My construction business was struggling. I needed the money. The defense attorneys tried to cross-examine Derek, suggesting he was lying to save himself. But his testimony was backed up by too much physical evidence and too many emails. The jury looked convinced. The defense's case was weak. They called character witnesses who testified that the defendants were good people and active community members. Patricia took the stand in her own defense, which her lawyer probably regretted. Under cross-examination, she fell apart. Mrs. Henderson, did you or did you not write this email to Linda Patterson? Marcus held up a blown-up copy of one of the damning emails. I did, but you don't understand the context. The email says, and I quote, "The well situation is working perfectly. No one suspects anything. What context could possibly explain that?" I was referring to the well on the HOA property, not Mr. Caldwell's well. Mrs. Henderson, the HOA property doesn't have a well. That's established fact. Patricia's face reddened. I misspoke. I meant the irrigation system. So when you wrote "make sure your husband keeps quiet," you were referring to the irrigation system that's detailed in public HOA records. It's been taken out of context. Marcus methodically walked her through a dozen emails, each one more incriminating than the last. By the time he finished, Patricia was in tears and her lawyer looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Richard, drinking bad coffee and trying not to think about what would happen if they were somehow acquitted. At 4:30, we got word that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. The judge called for order as the defendants were brought back in. Patricia looked like she'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. The jury foreman stood. In the matter of the state of Arizona versus Patricia Henderson on the count of conspiracy to commit theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of felony theft, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of embezzlement, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman continued through all 5 defendants, guilty on all counts. Patricia collapsed into her chair, sobbing. Linda stared straight ahead, expressionless. The other 3 defendants had varying reactions of shock and despair. The judge thanked the jury and set sentencing for 6 weeks out. He remanded Patricia and Linda to custody immediately, setting new bonds of $500,000 each. The other 3 defendants were allowed to remain free on their original bonds pending sentencing. Outside the courthouse, Richard and I faced a wall of cameras and microphones. "Mr. Caldwell, how do you feel about the verdict?" Jessica Torres asked. "I feel vindicated. This was never about revenge. It was about holding people accountable when they abuse power. I hope this sends a message that HOA board members aren't above the law. What do you hope happens at sentencing? That's up to the judge. I just hope the sentence reflects the seriousness of what they did. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was years of deliberate theft." The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later was emotional. Each defendant was allowed to make a statement before the judge imposed sentence. The 3 minor defendants expressed remorse and apologized to me directly. Their lawyers argued for probation, citing their minimal involvement and lack of prior criminal records. Linda Patterson stood silent, refusing to speak. Her lawyer argued that she'd been manipulated by Patricia and had acted out of misplaced loyalty to her husband. Patricia Henderson gave a rambling statement that blamed everyone but herself. She blamed me for having a well in the first place. She blamed Derek for not telling her the taps were illegal. She blamed the other board members for not stopping her. She blamed the HOA residents for expecting too much while paying too little in dues. The judge listened impassively. When Patricia finally finished, he sat back and addressed the courtroom. "I've been a judge for 23 years, and I've seen a lot of cases involving abuse of power. This case is particularly egregious because the defendants held positions of trust within their community. Homeowners elected them to manage common property and enforce reasonable rules. Instead, they used their positions to enrich themselves and steal from a neighbor. Mr. Caldwell relied on his well for 15 years without incident. The defendants knew this well was protected under Arizona water law. They knew they had no right to tap into it. They proceeded anyway, not out of necessity but out of greed. They wanted to save money and pay themselves inflated salaries. The defendant, Patricia Henderson, shows no genuine remorse. Her statement today demonstrates a complete failure to accept responsibility for her actions. Linda Patterson, while silent today, was equally culpable according to the evidence. The other 3 defendants bear less responsibility, but were still complicit in serious crimes. The judge sentenced Patricia to 4 years in state prison followed by 5 years of probation. Linda got 3 years in prison and 5 years of probation. The other 3 defendants each received 1 year in county jail, with the possibility of work release, followed by 5 years of probation. All 5 were ordered to pay restitution jointly and severally in the amount of $75,000, representing the value of the stolen water and electricity. Patricia's lawyer immediately announced they would appeal. Linda's lawyer said his client would consider her options. The other 3 accepted their sentences without appeal. As I left the courthouse, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It had been 9 months since I'd received that first letter from the HOA. 9 months of investigations, hearings, trials, and stress. But justice had been served. The civil trial was scheduled for 2 months later. Richard assured me it would be straightforward now that the criminal convictions were in place. In civil court, those convictions could be used as evidence of wrongdoing, making our burden of proof much easier. He was right. The civil trial lasted only 3 days. The HOA's insurance company had initially fought the claim, arguing that intentional criminal acts by board members weren't covered under the policy. But after the criminal convictions, they settled for $200,000 to avoid a trial verdict that might be even higher. The 5 individual defendants were still liable for the remaining damages and our attorney's fees, which came to another $150,000. Richard worked out payment plans with most of them, though Patricia continued to insist she'd pay nothing until her appeals were exhausted. The insurance settlement, combined with the criminal restitution, meant I recovered most of my losses and attorney's fees. More importantly, the case had sparked real change. The Arizona legislature passed the HOA reform bill in the next session. Similar bills were introduced in Nevada, California, and Texas. I started getting invited to speak at HOA reform conferences around the country. It was strange to be known as the guy who took down his HOA, but if my experience could help others, I was willing to share it. The Copper Ridge HOA underwent a complete overhaul. An emergency election removed the remaining board members and installed new leadership. One of the first acts of the new board was to apologize formally to me and offer to pay for an independent audit of all HOA systems to ensure there were no other irregularities. The audit found that Patricia and Linda had also been inflating landscaping costs and pocketing the difference, adding another $30,000 to their theft total. The new board filed additional claims with the insurance company and criminal charges with the district attorney. Frank was elected to the new board and made sure everyone knew that the well situation had taught the community a valuable lesson about oversight and accountability. Patricia Henderson's appeal was denied 8 months later. She began serving her sentence at the Perryville Women's Prison Complex in Goodyear, Arizona. Linda Patterson served her time at the same facility. The 3 other defendants completed their county jail sentences and probation without incident. 2 years after the whole ordeal began, I was working in my garden on a Saturday morning when a car pulled into my driveway. A woman in her 30s got out, looking nervous. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm sorry to bother you. I'm Bethany Miller. I live in Sun City, and my HOA is trying to force me to remove a solar panel system that I had installed before the HOA was formed. I've read about your case, and I wondered if you could recommend an attorney." I gave her Richard's contact information and invited her in for coffee. She told me her story, which was depressingly familiar. An HOA formed after she'd been in her home for years, then immediately started making demands that conflicted with her property rights. "Don't let them intimidate you," I told her. "Document everything. Know your rights. And don't back down if you're in the right." After she left, I stood on my porch looking out over my property. My well was still functioning perfectly, now properly secured and monitored. The 3 acres of land were as peaceful as the day I'd bought them. The HOA had tried to push me around, tried to destroy evidence of their crimes by forcing me to cap the well, and failed spectacularly. I thought about Patricia Henderson in prison, probably still blaming everyone but herself. I thought about Linda Patterson and the others, their lives derailed by greed and poor choices. I didn't take pleasure in their suffering, but I didn't regret pursuing justice either. The well had been here since 1978, long before any HOA, long before the subdivision, long before Patricia Henderson decided she could steal with impunity. It would be here long after all of us were gone. That thought gave me satisfaction. Some things endure, and property rights are worth defending. My phone buzzed. It was Richard with news that Patricia Henderson had been denied parole at her first hearing. The parole board cited her continued refusal to accept responsibility for her crimes. She'd serve at least 3 years before she could apply again. I put the phone away and went back to my garden. The Arizona sun was warm, the sky was clear, and my well was pumping clean water from deep underground, just as it had for decades. Life was good, and justice, however long it took, had prevailed. Frank came over that evening with steaks to grill. We sat on my back porch as the sun set, drinking beer and talking about everything except HOAs and water theft. Maria joined us later with homemade salsa and stories about their daughter's soccer team. "You ever think about moving?" Frank asked at one point. "After everything that happened?" "Never," I said. "This is my home. I bought it 15 years ago and I'll probably die here. No HOA was going to chase me off my own property." "Good," Maria said, "because we'd miss you if you left." As darkness fell, and the stars came out over the Arizona desert, I felt truly at peace for the first time in years. The ordeal had been exhausting and infuriating, but it had also reminded me what mattered: standing up for yourself, demanding accountability from those in power, and never backing down when you know you're right. The well continued to pump water through the night, its motor humming quietly in the darkness. My water from my well on my property, exactly as it should be. And somewhere in a prison cell in Goodyear, Patricia Henderson was learning that some people refuse to be pushed around, and that theft and abuse of power have consequences. The story spread beyond Arizona. I was interviewed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and several national news magazines. Each article focused on a different angle: HOA overreach, water rights in the American West, white-collar crime in suburban communities. But they all came back to the same basic story: a homeowner who refused to be bullied and exposed massive fraud in the process. The publicity led to policy changes beyond just Arizona. The Community Associations Institute, a national organization for HOA management, revised its ethics guidelines and began requiring more stringent financial oversight for member associations. Several states commissioned studies on HOA governance and accountability. I even got a call from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell my story as part of a larger piece about HOA abuses. I agreed, figuring the more attention paid to these issues, the better. The documentary aired on Netflix 18 months later and sparked another round of discussions about HOA reform. Through it all, I just tried to live my life. I kept up my property, maintained the well, and stayed active in local water rights issues. Tom Berkshire and I became good friends, and he occasionally brought other homeowners to see my well system as an example of proper management and security. The 3 acres felt more like home than ever. I added a greenhouse, expanded my garden, and even got a dog, a rescue named Copper who loved patrolling the property line. Life went on, richer and fuller than before, if only because I'd been reminded not to take my freedom and property rights for granted. Patricia Henderson was released from prison after serving 3 years. She moved to New Mexico to live with family and, according to mutual acquaintances, never set foot in Arizona again. Linda Patterson served her full sentence and emerged a changed person, by all accounts. She divorced Derek, who'd lost his contractor's license and now worked in his brother's auto shop. The other 3 defendants completed their probation and gradually rebuilt their lives. 1 moved away. 2 stayed in the area, keeping low profiles and staying far away from any HOA involvement. The Copper Ridge subdivision eventually recovered from the scandal. Property values rebounded as the new HOA board proved competent and honest. They operated with full transparency, posting all financial records online and holding regular open meetings. Frank served 2 terms on the board before stepping down, satisfied that the organization was on the right track. 5 years after that first letter arrived, I was invited to speak at a national HOA reform conference in Las Vegas. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of homeowners, attorneys, and legislators, I told my story one more time. "I'm not a crusader," I said. "I'm just a guy who wanted to be left alone on my own property." But when someone tries to steal from you, when they abuse power and think they can get away with it, you have to stand up, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. The Copper Ridge HOA board thought I'd be easy to push around. They thought I'd either not notice the theft or not have the resources to fight back. They were wrong on both counts. But here's the thing. They shouldn't have been able to get away with it for 7 years. There should have been oversight, audits, accountability from day one. That's what we need to fight for. Not the abolition of HOAs. They serve a legitimate purpose when managed properly. But reform, transparency, real consequences for board members who abuse their power. Because what happened to me could happen to anyone, and the next person might not have the resources or support system to fight back. The speech was well received. Afterward, dozens of people came up to share their own stories. Some had won their battles with HOAs. Others were still fighting. A few had given up and moved away. Each story reinforced why the work of reform was so important. Flying home to Prescott the next day, I looked out the airplane window at the Arizona landscape below. Somewhere down there was my 3 acres, my house, and my well, waiting for me. Secure and legally protected now in ways I'd never imagined necessary 15 years ago. Copper was waiting when I got home, tail wagging furiously. Frank and Maria had been watching him, and they came over to welcome me back and hear about the conference. We sat on the back porch, the same spot where so much of this story had unfolded, and talked late into the evening. "You know what the craziest part is?" Frank said at one point. "If Patricia had just left you alone, you might never have found those tap lines. They could have kept stealing for years, but she got greedy and paranoid and tried to force you to cap the well." He was absolutely right. The letter demanding I cap the well had been my first clue that something was wrong. If Patricia had been content to keep stealing quietly, I might not have discovered it until I sold the property or needed major well repairs. Her attempt to eliminate the evidence had led directly to her downfall. "Criminals make mistakes," I said. "Especially criminals who think they're smarter than everyone else." The moon rose over the desert, full and bright. Coyotes called in the distance. The well motor hummed its familiar rhythm. Everything was as it should be. In the years that followed, I settled fully into my role as an accidental activist for HOA reform. I testified before legislative committees in 3 more states. I wrote articles for law journals about property rights and HOA oversight. I consulted with attorneys representing homeowners in disputes with their HOAs. It wasn't how I'd planned to spend my retirement years, but it was meaningful work. Every time I helped someone understand their rights or contributed to reform legislation, I felt like the nightmare I'd gone through had served a purpose beyond my own vindication. The well continued to function perfectly. Tom Berkshire inspected it annually, and each time he marveled at how well the 1978 system had held up. "They don't make them like this anymore," he'd say, running his diagnostic tests. I remained vigilant about security. The cameras were maintained and upgraded. The locks were checked regularly. I'd learned the hard way that you can't assume your rights will be respected just because they should be. You have to protect them actively. 10 years after the initial letter from Patricia Henderson, I woke up one morning to find a note stuck to my front door. It was from a new neighbor who just moved into the subdivision. The note thanked me for standing up to the HOA and said that my story had inspired them to research HOA governance before buying their home. They'd chosen Copper Ridge specifically because of the reforms implemented after the scandal. "Your fight made this community better," the note concluded. "Thank you for not giving up." I kept that note on my refrigerator. On difficult days, when I questioned whether all the stress and publicity had been worth it, I'd rate it and remember that individual actions can have ripple effects far beyond what we imagine. The well, which had been at the center of everything, continued its quiet work. Drawing water from deep underground, providing for my property, standing as a testament to the principle that some rights are worth defending no matter the cost. It had been there before the HOA, it had survived their attempted theft and cover-up, and it would be there long after all of us were forgotten. Standing on my porch on that morning, reading the note from my new neighbor, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From that first outrageous letter, through the discovery of the theft, the investigation, the trials, the conviction, and the years of advocacy that followed. It had changed my life in ways I never expected, mostly for the better. I walked out to the well housing and opened it up, looking at the equipment that had caused so much trouble and taught me so much about standing up for what was right. The motor was running smoothly. The gauges showed good pressure. Everything was exactly as it should be. I closed the housing and headed back inside to start my day, grateful for my property, my rights, and the lesson that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to back down when you know you're right.